If you are planning to spend serious money on a new lens in 2026 or 2027, this is where I would start. I ranked 10 of the strongest lenses currently available across Canon, Nikon, Sony, Fujifilm, Sigma, Tamron, and Viltrox, not simply by sharpness, but by how useful they are, what they offer for the money, and whether they genuinely improve on the lenses photographers already trust. You are watching AltBuzz Lenses. Hit subscribe now, because by the time we reach number 1, you will understand exactly why it earned that spot. At number 10, we have the Tamron 90mm D3 Macro. Macro lenses evolve slower than almost any other category. Cameras leap forward every year, while macro glass sits forgotten until someone needs to photograph a ring, a flower, or the fine texture of a meal. The Tamron reaches true one-to-one magnification, while pairing that with modern autofocus, across full-frame Sony and Nikon bodies. The story isn't that it reaches one-to-one. Plenty of lenses do. The story is that a photographer no longer has to accept slow, hunting focus just to shoot deliberately close. 90mm also doubles as a short portrait lens, but that focal length is its ceiling. A travel or documentary shooter cannot build a day around it. Product photographers get a lens that moves seamlessly between a tabletop setup and a walk-around portrait session, without ever feeling like a compromise in either direction. And because the focusing motor is built for stills and hybrid work alike, it holds its own even when the subject refuses to stay still, which is more common in macro work than people expect. The Tamron proves a modern macro lens doesn't need to feel like a specialist tool until you actually move close enough to use it as one. The Tamron modernizes a specialist category. Number 9 takes a lens photographers already understand and asks how much smaller a professional system can become. At number 9, we have the Fujifilm XF 16 to 55mm f2.8 Mark II. Professional capability has always meant full frame weight. Fujifilm's answer is a constant f2.8 zoom that behaves on APS-C sensors like a familiar 24 to 84mm equivalent, covering events, travel, documentary, and street work without the usual bulk. The Mark II revision cut weight and size substantially, while adding faster, quieter autofocus for the newest high-resolution bodies. That matters because portability is the entire reason photographers choose Fujifilm in the first place. Where it loses ground is that its appeal lives almost entirely inside that ecosystem, and even some Fujifilm shooters may still find it large relative to what they expected from the system. It also closes much of the gap that used to exist between APS-C and full-frame zooms in terms of subject separation, especially at the long end of the range where the smaller sensor previously felt limiting. Fujifilm wins by reducing what photographers have to carry. Number 8 attacks a different problem entirely. How much premium performance should actually cost? At number 8, we have the Viltrox AF 135mm f1.8 LAB. The 135mm f1.8 category has long belonged to prestige glass from Sony and Nikon. Viltrox matched that exact specification: full-frame coverage, f1.8, autofocus, internal focusing, and priced it dramatically lower. This isn't a story about a cheap lens. It's a story about what premium means once a challenger hits the same numbers for meaningfully less. Buyers may still choose the first-party option for lower weight or tighter body integration, and those reasons are legitimate. But the Viltrox forces every buyer to ask whether that difference is worth the price. Its own weight is substantial, and that keeps it out of the top half of this list. It's also worth noting how quickly third-party manufacturers have closed the gap on build quality alone. Weather sealing, control rings, and autofocus motors that once separated first-party glass from everything else. Viltrox challenges how much portrait glass should cost. Number 7 ignores affordability completely and pushes optical ambition instead. At number 7, we have the NIKKOR Z 35mm f1.2s. 35mm has always belonged to context, weddings, documentary work, street photography. Nikon gave that familiar focal length an aperture normally reserved for dedicated portrait lenses, keeping the story around the subject while isolating them with startling force. This completes Nikon's run of flagship f1.2 primes, unlocking environmental portraits with real subject separation and low-light work that no longer forces a compromise between context and clarity. The cost is obvious the moment you pick it up. A 35mm prime is supposed to be the lens you forget you're carrying. This one asks you to accept size and weight in exchange for that extra stop and a half. Wedding photographers in particular gain something rare here: the ability to shoot a full room in available light and still pull the subject forward from the background, all without switching to a second lens mid-ceremony. Nikon pushes a familiar prime toward an extreme aperture. Number 6 takes something even more extreme and refuses to keep it fixed in place. At number 6, we have the Sigma 300 to 600mm f4DGOS Sports. 600mm 4 capability has always belonged to fixed focal length super telephotos. Sigma asked why that capability should be locked to a single distance at all, and built a lens that zooms from 300 to 600 without ever giving up f4. For wildlife and sports photographers, distance is never constant. An animal steps closer, a player breaks toward the sideline, and a fixed 600mm lens suddenly becomes too tight. This lets a photographer pull back without switching bodies or sacrificing light. It's the most extraordinary engineering on this list, and also close to 4 kilograms of gear that almost no one outside wildlife and sports work actually needs. Even carrying it for a single afternoon in the field changes how a photographer plans a shoot, from the tripod head they choose to how far they're willing to walk. The Sigma succeeds by doing something few photographers actually need. The top 5 begins with a lens thousands of professionals could use every single working day. Quick pause before we keep climbing. If rankings like this help you plan a purchase, staying subscribed means you won't miss the next one. Now, back to the countdown. At number 5, we have the NIKKOR Z 24 to 70mm f2.8 S Mark II. 24 to 70 at f2.8 has been the backbone of professional photography for decades. Nikon isn't reinventing it here, just refining it with lower weight, an internal zoom mechanism, and faster autofocus. The internal zoom matters more than it sounds. It keeps the lens balanced on a gimbal and predictable during a fast-moving assignment where there's no time to adjust for a shifting center of gravity. Its only weakness in this ranking is conceptual. It remains, at its core, a 24 to 70 f2.8, while competitors are stretching that formula further. For a photographer who shoots 5 or 6 different genres in a single week, that predictability is worth more than a flashier spec sheet. Nikon refined the professional standard zoom without changing what it fundamentally is. Number 4 applies that same philosophy to another category photographers have trusted for decades. At number 4, we have the NIKKOR Z 70 to 200mm f2.8 VRS Mark II. 70 to 200 at f2.8 is the telephoto every wedding, sports, and editorial photographer eventually reaches for. What Nikon changed isn't the formula, it's how much the lens costs the photographer physically to carry. Nikon cut the weight substantially from the previous generation, and that matters more than another marginal sharpness claim. Think about where this lens lives: 6-hour weddings, sidelines at a stadium, a strap digging in through an entire concert. Alongside the weight cut, tracking autofocus improved while zooming, and teleconverter compatibility remained intact. Photographers who shoot handheld for extended stretches often describe fatigue as the real limiting factor in a long assignment, more than any optical shortcoming. The Nikon improves the classic professional telephoto. Number 3 begins changing the traditional 2-lens professional kit itself. At number 3, we have the Canon RF 24-105mm f2.8 L IS USM Z. For decades, the professional kit has meant two lenses, a 24-70 and a 70-200, with a hard seam at 70mm, where a photographer stops and switches. Canon asks how many of those switches are actually necessary. Stretching a constant f2.8 zoom out to 105mm covers wide-angle, normal framing, and short telephoto portraits without breaking stride. This lens also plays a hybrid role with power zoom compatibility that video shooters rely on. The trade-off is size and cost. It's not the ideal travel companion for every photographer. For run-and-gun documentary work, that missing seam is the entire appeal, letting a photographer move from a wide establishing shot to a tight reaction shot in the same sequence. Canon changes where the professional standard zoom ends. Number 2 changes the aperture photographers have accepted from that category for decades. At number 2, we have the Sony FE 28-70mm f2G Master. The professional standard zoom has lived at f2.8 for decades. Sony breaks that ceiling entirely, holding a full f2 aperture from 28 to 70mm on an autofocus zoom, not a prime. That extra stop of light means shallower depth of field and far less pressure to grab a prime mid-event. This lens conceptually overlaps 28, 35, 50, and 70mm primes, not replacing them outright, but quietly reducing how often a photographer needs to interrupt an assignment to reach for one. Its ceiling of 28mm, rather than 24, is the one real compromise. For a fashion or editorial shoot, where the light drops fast and the schedule doesn't bend, this lens buys back time that would otherwise be spent swapping glass between setups. The 28-70 challenges the primes photographers carry beside a standard zoom. Number 1 challenges both those primes and one of the most important professional telephoto zooms at the same time. At number 1, we have the Sony FE 50-150mm f2G Master. No other lens on this list challenges more traditional lens decisions at once. This range occupies territory normally divided across a 50mm prime, an 85mm portrait prime, a 135mm prime, and a 70-200 zoom, and it holds f2 throughout. At 50mm, it delivers environmental portraits. Around 85, it moves into classic portrait territory. Push toward 150, and it compresses into tight, dramatic framing, suited to indoor sport and stage work. A conventional 70-200 still holds real advantages: 200mm of reach, teleconverter support, decades of familiarity. But for weddings, portraits, and indoor events, trading that reach for a wider aperture and a 50mm starting point is an extremely compelling exchange. What makes this lens genuinely rare is that it doesn't feel like a compromise at any point in its range, the way many super zoom-style lenses do. It doesn't make those primes or the classic 70-200 obsolete. It simply forces photographers to explain why they still need all of them in the same bag. Which lens would you put at number 1 in 2026? And which one here is ranked far too high? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. For more rankings that compare the best glass across Canon, Nikon, Sony, Fujifilm, and the third-party brands challenging them, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. Every lens on this list is a small argument about what a camera bag should look like in 2027. Some of you will agree with the order, some of you won't, and that's exactly where the conversation starts. Until the next one, keep shooting.